Welcome to the module 2. In this module, we are going to look at the reasons where we fail to include the sustainability decisions and why do we need to expand the boundaries for decision making. So the first question is that why are systems unsustainable and what have we missed? This question is very important because it helps us think how we have been doing the design, how have we been doing the things so far that has led to the problems that we have been facing now with the environmental damage. Once we understand that question, we would know how to rectify it or where do we need to improve so that we can actually design sustainable systems. So what enables the market to work? There is, of course, price or value setting, there is of course profit motive, private property and government and other regulating institutions. So far, when we are thinking about designing technological systems, we think of how it interacts in the economy. A lot of the time, the products we make have a price or value setting, and the companies that are making it or the industries, they have a profit motive. There is also this whole idea that there is a private property versus public property, and then there are regulating institutions. So the markets respond to all of these things. There are markets response to price, profit, privatization or public property and other regulations that can be part of it. But market does not include so far how does the environment get affected in these all scenarios. So for example, some of the human necessities often fail in markets. How much is clean air or water worth? Can you charge somebody for damaging your air? How much are you willing to pay for clean air? And should you have to pay for clean air? Is that even necessary? So what that means is that can we really put a price on environmental degradation? The field of economics that deals with these kind of questions is called as ecological economics. So that means that once people started noticing that the standard practices of how market was behaving or how it was even making strides or making decisions does not account for the environmental degradation, they started including and studying it to see that can we really put a price on environmental degradation and think about including it in our design decisions. Market failures. So what company did you buy air from? Of course, there are a lot of things which the environment provides us for free and there is no company that provides us. How much did you pay for air? How was that price set? Of course, that is also a question that never gets answered, or we don't even should not be answering that. How clean was the air you bought and how do you know? Of course, now people buy air purifiers all the time. Of course, people who can afford to buy, we all put air purifiers in our rooms. But what about the air outside? We are not immune from the effects of the outside air. But how do we know how clean the air is? And how can a company stop other companies from dirtying its air? Of course, we all can say that we are not the culprits, we are not the ones who are dirtying the air. It can be someone else, maybe someone else is burning or incinerating their waste. So, can we really stop others from doing that? Can we really put the burden of that decision on somewhere else? And also, if let's say we become very responsible or a company, what rate of return should a company expect to get from investing in air quality? If my neighbor is doing a good job in keeping the air clean, should that neighbor actually get the benefit for doing that? Which is, does the company get a return of investment? Because the way the markets are set up is that it's all about profit and the return of investment, which is very important criteria for the economic sustainability part. So one of the reasons is of course externalities. What are externalities? And it is an unintended cost or benefit of production or consumption that is not reflected in the price of the related transactions. And externalities are often borne by people who are not parties to the transactions that create them. So this is what we call as tragedy of commerce. What it means is that if we are making a product or if we are doing any activity, there is an unintended cost or benefit of production or consumption that is not there in the price of the related transaction. So if you are doing some transactions, the price is only about it does not include any unintended benefit, and we'll see certain examples that will make it clear. So whatever these externalities are, these are something that are not internalized in that price, and that is why these are called externalities, and these lead to tragedy of commons. What is the tragedy of commons? It was first described by Garrett Hardin, who was an American ecologist in 1968. What it says is that a shared resource in which any user reaps the full benefit of his or personal use, while the losses are distributed amongst all users, the result is tragedy, which means that there is a deterioration of the common pool resource. And that means that environment is kind of a shared resource that we all are relying on. And since whatever the profit people are deriving is privatized, but there is the cost that is there, or the degradation, it is shared by everyone, hence there is a tragedy of commons. So an example of tragedy of freedom in a commons is pasture land among various animal owners. And I can explain this by talking about the users. So let's say we have the herd owners, and every herd owner has certain number of actually the cattle who are grazing on that pasture land. So if you have to think about the tragedy of commons, you need to think about different users in the system. So here we have different herd owners are the system, and their cattle are grazing on the pasture. So for each of the user which is using this pasture land, which is your common resource, there is certain benefits and there are certain costs. So let's say if a user adds one more, so let's say I have one herd owner and they are actually more, now they have the capacity to buy one more animal. So they add one more animal to the herd. What are the benefits and the costs? The benefits obviously is that because of that addition of that one more cattle in their herd, they will have increased production of the milk. So and then they can sell it more and they get price. So benefit is to the herd owner who buys the cattle, let's say the cow, and it is basically increased milk production and increased profits. Okay. What are the cost? Because you have more cow, you will have more grazing. So the cost will be degradation of the soil, faster degradation of the soil. And the benefit is going only to one person, only to the herd owner who bought the cow. While the cost is going to all the herd owners. Of course, now you see that in this scenario, because everyone now can decide to let me also add more herd, and then everyone can do that, and it creates a overpopulation of the cows that grazes on the same pasture land, and it can completely destroy the pasture land by the soil degradation and no regrowth of the grasses, and eventually everyone loses that pasture land. So this is what is the phenomenon of tragedy of commons, is that when the profits are privatized, that profit is owned by one person, everyone thinks that now I also want to own that profit, and they will make a decision driven by that profit motive that they want to own, but not thinking about what are the negative costs that they are actually putting on the whole resource, and that is what is happening in the case of degradation of the grazing land. So our next example is the fisheries in ocean. So for this one, I would like you to take 30 seconds and think about the benefits and costs and write it down to understand what is the tragedy of commons that can happen in this case. Okay, let's see. The benefit, so the question is that what are benefits and cost of increasing fishing? Let's say there is a fisherman and the fisherman actually wants to increase fishing. The benefit is that the fisherman makes more money. And it is only to the fisherman who bought the new boat to fish more. What are the costs? The cost is that there will be a declining population of fish. So, declining population of fishes and it is actually borne by everyone. All the fishermen have to suffer. Now, because this fishery is actually getting damaged, eventually it will collapse and there will be no more fishes for anyone. The reason is that we need to give time to the natural systems to recover. If everyone decides to add more boats and increase fishing to just extract all the resource for their profit, then eventually the whole fisheries decline, and that is what is the tragedy of commons because of the overfishing that happens. So, bottom line is that for the use of commons and what leads to tragedy of commons, there are two things. One is the privatization of profits. Any decision that is made by one user of that common resource actually gets profit out of it, which is what we get the privatization of the profit. In the last two examples, you saw that in the case of the pasture land, the herd owner who adds the new cattle gets the benefit of increased milk production, and in the case of fisheries, the fisherman who buys a new boat to increase their fishing activity gets the benefit. And then the second thing that we note is that there is socialization of negative impact. In the case of pasture land, what we saw is that the decline of the pasture land actually affects everyone in the group, because now their cows cannot get enough grass to eat, and then they have reduced productivity. So, there is the socialization of the negative impact of overgrazing. Similarly, in the case of fisheries, there is the negative impact of socialization or the negative impact of decrease in the fisheries, which leads to the decline in the overall fisheries. So, that is the socialization of negative impacts. So, how do we overcome externality? What Hardin suggests is there is of course mutual coercion or the mutually agreed upon rules. So, the communities can come together and talk about how do we actually go about preserving this common pool. So, however, there are drawbacks to strict legislation, but of course, there is no perfect solution. And of course, the status quo will be worse than the regulated situation. Hence, there are now policies and regulations for improving air quality, improving the vehicle emissions efficiency, and also improving the water quality. So, similarly, there can be taxes. There are some countries in the world where there is a taxation for actually polluting. And there are other strategies which could be like what we have in the global protocol for Kyoto Protocol, which is a mutually agreed upon strategies to come to mitigate the climate change. So, there can be community norms, which is what the Kyoto Protocol talks about, and but there can also be hard cap. So, there can be also how much a company can actually emit. So, these are all of the ways where Hardin suggests that we can overcome externality by making rules and regulations and policies and talking about it, that realizing that there are externalities that do not reflect in the cost of the market, but can be accounted in some other way. So what the business and environment, the new approach is moving from environmental management to environmental strategy. Instead of thinking that in the older times, most businesses thought that environmental management is a necessity, it's a necessity that they really do not enjoy. It's kind of an obligation, but it was not an opportunity to win stakeholders. However, there are now changes from what we call as win-lose perspective to win-win perspective. So what is this win-lose and win-win perspective? In win-lose perspective, what the thought process is that economic growth, if we want economic growth, such as the point B, you see high economic growth, on the x-axis is the economic growth, on the y-axis is the environmental protection. This means that if you really want economic growth, you really have to give up on environmental protection, which was an old way of thinking. Or if you have to really improve on your environmental protection, you will definitely be actually reducing your economic growth. This is what the win-lose scenario is, that you win on one aspect, which is the economic growth, but we are actually losing on the other aspect, which is the environmental protection. And of course, most people will settle somewhere in this region where you have a balanced approach. But this is a win-lose perspective. We can have a win-win perspective where your economic growth actually improves the environment, and that could be like we set up a new wetland, and that wetland is providing, let's say, job opportunities and more production from that system, and that also leads to the environmental protection. However, such opportunities are rare, but there are of course now the mindset change of thinking of that win-win perspective. And there is this environmental strategy where you totally change the system. So you go from, let's say, this from A to D, which is our win-win perspective. So you are actually increasing in the economic growth and also improving environmental protection. And once you reach here, now you have to find the new optimal point, because in this also you could be here where you have definitely improved on the environmental protection, but now if you want to further improve, you will have a reduction in the economic growth. Similarly, you can have the lower economic growth and much higher environmental protection in the same system. So this is where the optimization is going to happen. So yeah, quickly think about a recent example of environmental strategy. So one example of environmental strategy is moving to renewable resources. When we think about moving to renewable resources, what we are doing is we are actually improving on environmental protection by moving towards biomass or something. And also, so we have completely changed the system because we are moving away from the fossil. But within that system, we are still struggling to actually optimize so that we can provide more economic growth by improving on the profitability of that systems. Another example is the renewable energy. Some places renewable energy may be costly, but the prices have come down and have becoming really cost competitive now. So of course, they went from the environmental strategy perspective, because as you introduce renewable systems, you are also providing more job opportunities. There is definitely economic growth, but once you are there, you are competing with the already existing system. So now to make the economic profitability, you have to optimize within the system. So that's one example where we have really used the environmental strategic approach. The other reason why we have failed in developing sustainable systems so far is this reductionist versus holistic systems view. Most of the education today is very reductionist in that we look at the parts of the system and explain. So, and fable is that there was an elephant, different people were touching different parts of it. So some people would say it's a rope, some people say it's a tree, some people say it's a snake, some people who held the ear will say it's a fan. So you see different people see different aspects of the same system and they work on that system, and that's a very reductionist way of working. And that has caused challenges, because when as engineers and scientists we are studying a part of the system. Of course, we do fabulous job of understanding that and also designing it, but we fail in terms of actually leading. We actually fail in terms of thinking about how it interacts with other parts of the system, because that is the full story. So, how it interacts, that affects what its performance will be in the overall. So, the reductionism is still there, the whole system and interconnections are not included, and the microscopic view of science, which focuses on fine scale, does not zooms out on the wider scale impact. And because of that, most of the decisions are short-sighted. We have also wide scale degradation, and we are not ready to adapt to changes, because when you design the part of the system without thinking about its interaction with other system, and most of the systems are dynamical, what we are doing is we are actually not making it ready to adapt, because it's now fixed. So, how do we overcome reductionism? We take the systems approach, and this is what in this course we will learn the techniques of these systems approach, like life cycle analysis, industrial ecology, and some of the footprint methods. So, what does an engineer do in the sustainable systems designing? We design systems to ensure that we meet the demands. We reduce or slow down degradation. We use the resources wisely, which will take into the sustainability paradigm. We make the system robust, catastrophe resilience, and also adaptable to forthcoming changes. Most of the time we don't think about that. If you have to think of designing sustainable systems, that's another thing that is very important. And of course, we try to think about the three pillars of sustainability: the social, ecological, and economical goals, and we use that in our design and analysis and take a holistic approach. Of course, it is challenging. There are tools and techniques that are being developed. We will learn some of those tools in this course, but of course, there is a wide range of things that are still required. Okay. So, what are some of the approaches for sustainable design that we can think of? One is of course very easy that people have adopted, is enhancing efficiency using renewable resources, which is part of our environmental strategy, energy and biomass utilization. Learning from nature, which is where industrial symbiosis, biomimicry, techno-ecological synergy comes, and then the adaptive management, like can the systems adapt, which is more of a dynamical systems approach. We will not go through everything in this course. We will learn mostly the techniques of industrial ecology, life cycle analysis and footprint method. But when you think about sustainable designs, these are some of the key points that you can actually focus on. In summary, most of the markets and design of processes and products ignore the environmental cost, and that is why we have been leading to unsustainable systems. We are mostly about looking at the environmental management, which is the end of pipe solution, and then we also have the reductionism that is prevailing. So, hence what we would be learning more in this course is to adopt systems view for sustainable systems design. With this, we will get to two quick quiz questions that are based on this module. The first question here is, we have oceans are polluted with plastic wastes. This is considered a case of tragedy of commons. Recalling that there are two key participants in this phenomena, write down the following. First, the private benefits, and then the social cost. Take 30 seconds. Okay. So, let us go to the private benefits. The use of plastic benefits is basically by the individual that is using, and it provides them the cheap storage. Of course, when we are using plastic, every individual is using it and it is providing them the cheap storage. That is the privatization of benefits. But the cost which is getting distributed amongst different people is the cost of disposal of plastic is shared by everyone, because it is going into rivers, oceans and landfills, and whatever negative externalities is happening, it is shared by everyone in the system. So, this is a classic case of tragedy of commons. Your next question is, what are the two main causes of unsustainable systems in today's world? Please write those two main causes in 30 seconds. So, the two main causes that we discussed in this module is first is the negative externalities are not accounted in design. We talked about that most of the economic paradigms or the market used in the design is actually not accounting for the cost in the design process. So, that is the negative externality. And also there is reductionist view for design. Most of the times we are only considering part of the system when we are designing. We do not consider the interactions of that with other parts of the whole system, and hence the systems become unsustainable as other parts change. Hence, when we are going to think about sustainable systems design, we will look at the holistic systems view, which we start from the next module.